Yeah, so Mark, I'm curious as to where you first encountered, if you can remember your first sort of encounter with William Blake. And then I suppose since that encounter and with the in writing this book and all your encounters so far, who was William Blake?
I guess he's been one of these figures that has been around and about in my psyche one way or another, ever since. We must have read Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright at school, I suppose. He gets anthologized, of course. But really, it's living in South London, where I am, that made me want to get to know him better because I'm very interested in mystical traditions, particularly rediscovering Christian mystical traditions. And Blake is, you get the sense that he's like a prime candidate for that, although people have all sorts of different relationships with Blake. But for me, that was always a big part of the draw. But at first pass, well, I was going to say he's not very easy to get into. I think what he actually gives you is he gives you some nice sort of entrees, if you like, the world, to see a world in a grain of sand, or if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. These kind of phrases that are very resonant. You think, oh, he's onto something, and I wouldn't mind being onto that too. But quite what happens next is more tricky because his poetry and his imagery doesn't just tell you stuff, it works on you, and you have to kind of change to get it, I think. So it's not easy. But it is a formation, that's the promise. He says, I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. And I do believe him in that. I don't think he was just, you know, a postmodern poetic flourish avant la lettre sort of thing, which is how some people do read him now. Um, but what helped was partly being in London, because I think that reading his work in places where he was strangely helps open things up a bit. You just get a sort of a sense that somehow this is resonant and matters. But then I've also been a great beneficiary of an organization called the Temenos Academy, which do slow readings, particularly of texts like Blake, um, Dante too, which I wrote about. That opened up for me through the Temenos Academy, and with very good teachers. And so that was what then led to me thinking, "Oh, and now I want to try and write about this myself and see where that takes me." So it's a kind of continual process, but driven by this sense he's got something. I really do think he's got something, and it can speak to us now, of course, all those kind of things too. Um, yeah, so he's become, I'd say now, a friend, someone that I can pick up, um, have a read, and it says something to me rather than just sort of feeling like it's promising something, but it's not wholly clear what.
Right. And I suppose that perhaps also, in a way, the way you're describing that sort of it's not clear what speaks to I my senses is the main, I don't know what we call it. I don't even know if faculty is the right word because faculty we associate with a sort of it's limited to almost the human brain or something, but the imagination, and which was fairly central to William Blake's I spirit perhaps and what he was getting at. So what is, because I think the imagination to William Blake isn't maybe what the imagination is in a sort of everyday, it's sort of deeper than perhaps what we ordinarily might think of imagination.
Yeah, I think he saw emerging the default sense of the imagination that people have now, which is that the imagination is certainly a great thing, but it's as likely to delude you as to help you. And it's really a private faculty that some people have copiously, other people have to a lesser extent. So it's something that, a bit like consciousness, that's imagined as somehow being generated inside your skull. Maybe if you're a bit more embodied minded, you somehow sense it must be something to do with the body as well. But certainly it's not something that exists outside of us. Rather, we kind of project it onto the world and add a bit of color to the world. And this was an idea that was emerging in Blake's time in the Georgian period. Figures like David Hume and John Locke particularly were developing this idea, and they were quite explicit about it. They said, this is very different from an older sense of the imagination, which was something that we actually participated in. It wasn't like a something we somehow caused through neurological activity, but that actually we were already born into a great sort of flow of consciousness and meaning and imagination, call it God, call it spirit, call it what you like. And that the human invitation was to become more aligned with that, to participate in it. And so, an artist, put that in inverted commas, of course, because that's a rather modern word, but would see themselves as being inspired, literally breathed into by a muse or by a god, by a spirit. Plato writes about that. He has a whole dialogue devoted to that, what it is to be seized by a muse. And this was coming undone though in Blake's time, and I think that partly for philosophical reasons. He's a great thinker. He just disagreed with people like Adam Smith and David Hume and John Locke, partly because he thought that the human imagination, as a sort of solitary, isolated capacity, is not that creative. It couldn't create a whole world in which we share. We must receive this whole world,
Right.
collaborate with it. But and I work in mental health, and you see this. You meet people who are trapped in a kind of privatized imagination, and it can be very florid. But it's kind of boring after quite quickly. It just doesn't go anywhere. It just is sort of on repeat. Whereas Blake's in that tradition. There's many others. I mean, a prominent one actually is Albert Einstein. He said something very similar about the imagination. That actually, no, it's given to us to bear truth to us.
Mm.
And we need to discern things. Any inspiration, this is an ancient insight. If you received a message from an oracle, you didn't just take it at face value. You had to work on it. It called forth something in you to release its meaning. And so the imagination is an active stance. It's not just as another quite common idea now is, you just have some sort of peak experience, maybe a psychedelic trip, and somehow something sort of seizes you, but leaves you in a rather passive state that then it
Mm.
takes time afterwards to somehow work out. Now, Blake thought that all day, every day, we can be in a kind of active stance towards this great flow in which we're immersed and develop our capacities to work with it and to receive its truth, and to expand ourselves into what he called eternity. So, yeah, the imagination is absolutely key to Blake, but its power, which I allude to in the title of my book, is that if you like, I don't have imagination, you don't have imagination. The imagination has us. And the question is how much we want to open to that, to cleanse the doors of perception. That phrase is referring to the philosophy of people like John Locke that said our senses are doors, they cut us off. And Blake's saying, no, that very philosophy, the doors of perception philosophy needs to be cleansed. And then we can see the senses as kind of thresholds or doorways into this participation, imaginatively discerned, but the senses then become just the first or surface appearance of a great world of liveliness and vivacity. So he's wanting to help us recover a sense of what it is to be alive, really, but
Mm.
conscious and imagination and so on, that he saw being reduced in his time through quite an imaginative act. It takes quite a lot of imagination to imagine that somehow you can create all the color in the world around you. Again, which is sort of a default position in the
Yeah.
philosophy of mind, that there's not redness in the world, but somehow we create this redness. And then you get all these bizarre conversations about, but is the redness I see the same as the redness you see? If that happened in a psychiatric hospital, it would be put down to some sort of insanity. But this is also like official philosophy in mainstream universities and so on as well. So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
something very powerfully gone wrong, I think, in the way we think about all
Yeah.
these things. And
Yeah.
Blake's key in trying to get us back on the right path.
And I think just what comes to mind there, actually, and I know you're very familiar with him and you cite him a lot, is and I think Iain McGilchrist has written quite eloquently on the sort of a critique of the sort of strange malaise we find ourselves in. And actually, he speaks often about how perhaps, contemporary, Western, it's almost like too rationalistic, and actually perhaps there's this sort of paucity, like you're describing, or rather what William Blake was intuiting, was this sort of we need to be open into it, like encountering what's beyond us perhaps, and actually and I think you've used the word, this idea of almost being porous, which is perhaps contrary, or stands in opposition to where, like you said, when people perhaps become unwell, they're imagining it's not so much the imagination in terms of, like William Blake saying, in terms of to help us encounter what's beyond us, but rather it's more of like a fantasy, in that they're not encountering or able to encounter what lies beyond them, but they increasingly become sort of narrowing in on themselves almost.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a very useful distinction which was made by a near contemporary of Blake, which was made by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, poet and a philosopher as well. And he draws that distinction, which maybe, you're alluding to there, between fantasy and imagination. And he says it's an arbitrary use of the words. It needn't, um, there's something written into the words that make it this way. But the point is to make a distinction. And fantasy is just the natural turning over of the mind. If you at all remember your dreams, you'll know that some dreams, or some parts of dreams even, seem just like the mind mixing up imagery from the previous day, say, and it doesn't really go anywhere. But then other parts of the dream will have a very arresting images to you that carry meaning. It's maybe a snapshot of your imaginative life, your inner life, your emotional life, that you want to stay with because you realize it's trapping you, or it's going to take you somewhere. So it's learning to tell the difference between those two
Mm.
that Coleridge was onto, and I think that similarly, in McGilchrist's work has sort of used something that people trust, neuroscience. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure why they trust it so much. Again, if you work in a psychiatric hospital, you become very, very aware of how little is known about the brain. And not just like a kind of incremental, there's more to know, but how many profound puzzles there are about it.
Mm.
A brain scan, for example, can't tell the difference between someone who's functioning perfectly normally in life and someone who's catatonically depressed, so much so they can't even get out of a chair.
Yes.
So there's this huge lacunae with this neuroscience. But nonetheless, for some reason, stick a brain scan image on the front of a newspaper and everyone thinks it's telling you the truth. So Iain has got onto that.
Mm.
And there is science here too. I shouldn't be too dismissive. But it's, I think, giving us permission to realize that uh, uh, we need more than just a kind of material understanding of ourselves in order to really have a rich enough anthropology, a sense of what it is to be human. And people have warmed to that very much, which I think is why, people have really, responded well to it. And this language of left and right hemispheres and so on has certainly in parts of the world that I live in has entered the common currency again.
Yeah, it is on that though. It's a really, we won't get distracted too much on it, but it is fascinating. As you say, there is this sort of, I don't know if there's almost like it's almost like fantastical, the sort of sometimes the assertions people draw from, yeah, like you say, like neuroimaging and stuff. And I always find it interesting is that the whole study of it was even coined neural correlates of consciousness. And yet there are then these conclusions which are much further reaching, such as like this is causing the perception of redness. But anyway, um,
I mean, just on that, I think the thing that people forget is that, well, they both remember and forget it, that the brain is this immensely complex organ.
mm,
Some people say it's the most complex thing in the cosmos. And yet they then get very simple about the way they understand it.
mm,
And there's a great writer out this on this actually, who she's a philosopher of science, but also was a neuroscientist, called Masmita Chiramuta, and she makes precisely this point. She's at Edinburgh, and so one way of thinking about that is that what you see in the brain very much is very much determined by what you take to what you want to see. So if you are looking at it at the level of, say, the hemispheres, stuff will show up. If you're looking at it at the level of individual neurons, stuff will show up. If you're looking at it at the level of networks, stuff will show up. But every level, if you like, that you look at the brain means that you lose contact with all the other levels too. And there are, potentially, I don't know, dozens, even in models, levels of the brain. And so I think it's always worth remembering that, the brain can kind of give you a nudge. And, if you've got something physiologically wrong with your brain,
Mm,
then it may be that an intervention can help.
mm,
But even then, the fact that extraordinary things can be done with brain surgery doesn't mean that the brain itself is well understood.
sure.
Which is why you have these strange operations where people have to remain conscious to make sure you're touching the right bit.
Right.
Anyway, there's a whole
Yeah,
area there.
well, it just and also yeah, but on that then, I think I wonder as well, like the bearing it almost has on this kind of idea of the imagination with William Blake, in that again, like when people such as we are now, perhaps, just at least perhaps shining a light on, that conceptualization of the relationship between the brain and consciousness, which is sometimes put forward by, like, I don't know what's called, like, materialists and stuff. It's not so, it's like when making that critique, it doesn't necessarily mean one is saying that the brain is not implicated or extremely, in consciousness and perhaps the shaping of it. And I actually wonder, in a way, does this have a bearing upon, like, if we think of, William Blake saying that the imagination has us, and that, in a sense, life is an imaginative, and, it is the imagination, it is imaginative. The brain, in a sense, there's a sort of I don't know, it's almost a physiological sort of correlate to that, in that if you even look at, like, developmental psychology or the development of a human, you think of, like, Piaget and or like Vygotsky, and this idea of actually to become an adult, one has to be sort of taken forward by this sort of a capacity to imagine, to sort of further encounter what lies beyond. And that if the brain is somewhat, I don't know, neurodevelopmental disorder or difficulty, then one doesn't get to perhaps as fully encounter life as some of the counterparts might. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one element in a whole. I was going to say causal chain, but I'm even nervous of the word causal, to be honest. I prefer the idea of sympathies,
Mm,
because with resonances and harmonies and so on, rather,
mm, mm,
if you push one bit, then something else happens somewhere else down the line.
mm.
Um, but yeah, you're right. And I mean, a couple of thoughts there actually, just to maybe go in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
That I think that developmental story that's come out of 20th century psychology um, also illuminates something that's central to Blake and lots of other writers as well, which is that it's often through processes of crisis that life does expand. Life is not plain sailing towards a sunny horizon. It's often through developmental crises. Well, it is through developmental crises that the world expands. Because to put it more personally, in ways that Blake would understand, you have to let go of something in order to let more in. And we do tend to build these perceptions of reality, which are imaginative creations in contact with reality. But that as we, get older, um, that an early infantile model, say, breaks down, it's not adequate. And that can be even a traumatic experience, but certainly can be a troubling experience. But the promise is that on the other side of that breakdown is a kind of breakthrough, and it's preparing you for a wider perception of things. Um, and Blake writes about this. He has different. He writes about it mythologically, I think. So he invites you to enter the worlds of his mythology, and that kind of educates you in different kinds of perception. So he'll talk about Ulro, which is a very particular but narrow kind of perception, that where the imagination is all focused on particularly measurement and the tangible. It's the closest to the kind of rational materialism of a narrow worldview. But then there's one he calls generation, which is suddenly realizes that life has cycles and pulses, and there's life, but there's also death, and there's sunrise, but there's also sunset, and so it's a much more dynamic sort of perception of things. And you realize that it has a life of its own. It's not a life that you wholly control through your measurements and you're pushing and pulling. And but generation two has its limits. But it has a sort of edge he calls regeneration, where it's like, so where did this life even come from? What's underpinning this life? What's its wellspring and source? And that leads to another sort of worldview that he sometimes calls Beulah, and then eventually he kind of gets to this divine perception, which he, to my mind, is very clear that everything springs from God. That's why he's a mystic, and the invitation is for us to recover a sense of that, which he calls eternity or Eden, and Jerusalem's gate, and so on.
Yes, and that makes me think of what I think you said, which is that because you cited, you've mentioned there he did fundamentally it was I suppose about God, and it comes from God and it's about encountering God, but at the same time he was too religious for church. So
Yeah.
yeah, what's that about?
Well, it's partly a comment on his times. So George in England and the Church of England at the time had a monopoly on basically any part of civic life. If you wanted to be, a lecturer in a university, you had to show you were a signed up Anglican. If you wanted to be a civil servant, you had to be a signed up Anglican.
Right.
There were dissenters, there were Catholics, but particularly Catholics were viewed with great suspicion. They were probably in league with the Pope as much as with the King, kind of thing. So Blake was born into a dissenting family. His mother was a Moravian, and so he was born with this kind of suspicion, if you like, of the Church of England and its monopoly, and how that corrupted the church. Um, but he did go to church when he had to. We know that he was baptized in St James's Piccadilly. He was married in St Mary's Battersea. He probably went to his father's funeral. Those are the three times that we know he went to church. But because you had to go to church then. And in some ways, I feel like the situation of the Church of England now, where it's in very steep decline. Um, it's a sort of memory of the part it plays in our national life as much as a really living part that it plays in our national life that keeps it going. But in some ways, it's 200 years on. It's what happens when monopolies lose their monopoly. They've lost their vitality in the process, and so go into decline. And I feel that part of what Blake can offer is a kind of recovery of the vitality that people are looking for. That's another feature of our times now. It does seem like if interest in religion, and many people would never even think to ask a priest for advice on their inner life or their spiritual life. It just wouldn't occur to them. But nonetheless, there's a lot of people who are seeking that. And so, and you see that in psychotherapy. Um, I think that, there's still a huge kind of need. And so, I hope that people like Blake can partly respond to that because they can transmit what's almost a forgotten way of looking at things.
Yeah, and I wonder that, like you said there, that sort of perhaps, which yeah, I think it's been documented, hasn't it, recently, like this sort of increase in people attending churches, and there seems to be this sort of revival in a sort of a thirst for something. I was going to say the divine, but I don't. Yeah, the divine or something more. And in a way, then is that sort of reading it through William Blake, and would William Blake see it then as a sort of it's because in the the current milieu or sort of zeitgeist or times is that people have in a way become shut off from the imagination, and given that we are of the imagination and that it is sort of the wellspring from which we come, if we become shut off from it, we feel it, we know it, and there's and therefore we sort of want to turn back to it almost.
Yeah, you can't put it down, I think. I mean, because the point, it sort of takes actually a hell of a lot of imagination to imagine yourself, for example, to be a machine.
Mm.
R.D. Laing made this famous remark about the scientist who says the human is a machine might win a Nobel Prize, but the person who says they're a machine will probably end up in a psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
And it's again, that tension, it takes an enormous amount of energetic imaginative power to sort of hold it together because it is a complete contradiction. And I feel that that's part of what's going on in our times. That this contradiction is people are realizing it's not sustainable. It's too
Mm,
costly, and that cost shows up in all sorts of ways, not just people's personal lack of well-being, but the way that it leads us to, misuse the world around us and relate badly to each other, and um, that can feel even approaching disastrous now. Um, and I think that someone like Blake would have a sort of spiritual analysis of that, if you like, which is that the tensions become unbearable. It is breaking down, but there's meaning in the breakdown, which through guidance, through discernment, it takes work, it takes effort. It's not just a kind of random grasping of the latest kind of spiritual trend, or your personal sort of spiritual fancy, because this is about how the world is, not just about me finding a way through life, sort of spiritual bypassing, you might say. um, so it's a great challenge, but it's also a great challenge, because it is about the recovery of our humanity.
yeah. And then so in the parts of the book I have read of your this book on William Blake, what's clear is this component or this element which I think was with William Blake throughout his life, which was this, and I think it, for me, it makes me think of this distinction. I think it was, you said Coleridge made between fantasy and imagination. And so then this component I'm talking about, this element which William Blake had to contend with, or not even contend, maybe because it wasn't contentious, but he experienced, was he had these sort of encounters with like fairies and angels. And so, yeah, could you describe that? How maybe other people have observed that and what they've made out of it and what you make out of it. Yeah.
I mean, one thing which I do feel we need to do with that is not just try and analyze it in a way that keeps us safe in our worldview, which
Right.
again is the default position, I think, for many who write about William Blake, particularly, living in a psychological age. The temptation to diagnose is very strong, and people
Right.
offer various options there. Um, again, anyone who's had clinical experience will realize how ridiculous that is, because diagnosing is very tricky when you've got someone who's sat in front of you, let alone, trying to diagnose someone who lived in a different time and place 200 years ago. And anyway,
Yes.
diagnoses are just ways of bundling symptoms,
Mm.
and trying to put together something that helps someone to live better.
Yes.
It's not like there's a disease, that
Hmm.
with a viral cause or something. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
again, that's that whole area. But
Yeah. 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 For
um,
sure.
I think that what what an alternative approach then is to say, look, Blake clearly was smart. Clearly, what he was onto has had tremendous life. 200 years on, you know, hundreds of thousands of people want a taste of Blake. When there was the great exhibition in 2019 at Tate Britain, of Blake's work, 250,000 people came to that exhibition in a
Wow.
few months. And that doesn't happen when someone's just crazy. Um,
Mm.
he's they intuit a promise of life here, and that
Mm.
I think includes how he lived every day, I think, with creatures, beings, entities, presences,
Hmm.
lights,
Hmm.
that you or I might get a glimpse of and then doubt or wonder about. I think it's a continuum, though. That's the approach I try to take. And I mean, in psychotherapy, I work in psychodynamic psychotherapy, and we use the felt presence of someone, or an image that might come into the mind. There's already built into psychodynamic psychotherapy a sense of the porous. It's called fancy names like transference and countertransference, but
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
learn to trust that those intimations take you somewhere. It's not automatic, but if you're open to them, then it opens something up.
Mm.
And I think that Blake must have had a kind of porous mode of perception that could um, work with these things really quite directly.
Mm,
And through poetry, through imagery, and so on, bring it into some kind of manifestation.
right.
And the other, looking at it from the other perspective, is that in my kind of interests in history of ideas, the most fascinating people have quite regularly said that they too lived with other intelligences. So Socrates had his daemon. Dante talks about angels all the time. Even someone like Newton, it turns out, was very fascinated by Renaissance philosophy, particularly Marsilio Ficino, who too talked about these entities and intelligences. And I use the word intelligences sort of deliberately because I think that um, this is what you might call the inside of the whole world and not just we're very used to the inside of my own head and maybe even having a sense of different parts of yourself, or
Mm,
in a dream you'll have different characters in the dream. It doesn't take too much to reflection to realize that whilst we are, I think, wholes, we're wholes made up of different parts that have to find some sort of mode of relating. And I think that that is true for the insides of the whole world as well. We're not some sort of strange anomaly or exception in that. There are many different parts to this inner vitality of things.
mm,
And um, people that are particularly clued up to that, who trust their imagination, no doubt through the vagaries of birth as well, and didn't have it educated out of them. Blake says that actually. He says that, you know, many, many more people can see like this, but we're very inclined to have it educated out of us.
mm.
The self-policing in this, I think, is enormous. Um, but there's still a need to discern, and that's it's those two elements coming together. But there's a reason why, I don't know if it's all cultures apart from our own, but certainly many, it would seem, have had perceptions of, the little people, or the angels, or demons and so on as well, of course.
Mm.
And I want to take Blake seriously about that and see where it can take me.
Yeah, interesting. Where it can take you, because yeah, when I asked the question, because I suppose yeah, I could imagine why some, like you sort of refer to, some would have a tendency. Again, probably comes from the culture we live in terms of we need to sort of diagnose it and explain it away like that. And no, I wouldn't. I'm not necessarily seeing it like that, and particularly at the end of the day, if it sounds like it, well, firstly for many reasons, but one of them also is that if it's enriching and it sounds like it led to a sort of a more a fuller life, maybe in a sense, or a richer life. I suppose what I was wondering though is in the sense of how does, and like you say there, I'm wondering when you say where does it take me, I suppose what I'm wondering is when people read that or they hear about that, does that then almost, do they equate that with that's just fantasy, whereas they might though be open to this idea of the imagination as being that which allows us to encounter one another, whereas this sort of component of, or I don't know what this component is, where say William Blake, but I know others like you're saying have experienced these, have these experiences with, I don't know what we call them, agencies or things beyond them. We don't, I don't know what they are.
Hmm.
But I suppose it sounds like what you're saying is maybe it's sort of like a continuum, and it's not. Yeah, I don't even know if I'm making sense there.
Yeah. Um, I mean, take the case of Socrates. It's well attested, not just in Plato, but other sources, that he had what was called a daemon at the time.
Yeah.
It was before demons became bad guys. That only happened around the turn of the millennium, with the emergence of Christianity. But daemons they were just kind of go-betweens. And he said that his daemon was a go-between between him and the god Apollo.
Mm,
And I think that Apollo particularly resonated with Socrates because Socrates was living at this point where the sense of a kind of cosmic unity and a divine unity was beginning to be perceivable. And Apollo in Greek means not many. And so Apollo is the kind of god that heralds what became monotheism, and the sense that there is a kind of underlying unity to all things. And you need a sense of inner unity, i.e., the sense of being an individual in the way that you or I would quite spontaneously experience it, to receive that perception of cosmic unity. It needs to have a kind of mirror inside yourself in order to show up clearly. And I think that's one of the things that's happening in this period around figures like Socrates and, in fact, Jesus in Christianity as well.
Mm.
Um, so there's a kind of, in response to your question, there's a kind of world story, if you like, that you can tell, that gives you um, sort of deeper sense of what this might be about. But also with Socrates, he's very fascinating because he says quite clearly that this daemon always only told him what not to do. It always spoke to him in the negative. And I think that's very, very telling, because if someone speaks to you in the negative, it takes you to a kind of threshold where you're on the cusp of what you do know and what you don't know. But of course, that is an expansive place to be. And I think there's parallels here in psychotherapy. You know, that one of the differences, say, between a clinical psychology and psychotherapy, although these things are always blurred actually in practice, but nonetheless, that a clinical psychologist can help you with positive things to do to get you through a crisis. You know, kind of behavioral techniques and so on, and they can be very, very valuable when people are in crisis. But psychotherapy is offering something else. It's saying, let's not uh, work out what you need to do. Let's stay with what this might mean in this more
Mm.
liminal zone. And you know, the hope is that that is a place of expansion. So you don't just, as it were, return to your normal life before with relief, so it's not to be sniffed at, but with nothing really changed. Rather, maybe there's meaning in this. And I think Socrates' Daemon was quite like that. You know, being told, you know, sometimes it was quite trivial. It was stuff like the Daemon would say, "Don't go left," and he would think, "Okay, so where do I go? Do I carry straight on? Do I turn right?" Anyway, and then you know he would encounter someone and have some
Mm.
important conversation. Other times it was very big, like when he was in prison awaiting the hemlock and his execution. He could have left. He could have easily paid a fine and gone
Yeah.
into exile, and he didn't because the Daemon said, "No, stay." And so that was a much bigger, I don't know where this is leading.
Mm.
Um, and so, but the point was, that mode also, it always makes more of you and who you are. It invites you to step into the situation, not just be kind of moved around like a puppet, or, you know, much more common these days would be to regard yourself as a sort of computer program that if only you can tweak the right bit will function better.
Mm.
So I think that, again, it's a deeply inviting possibility to me,
Mm.
not only because it feels like it makes better sense of the world in which we live, which, you know, you have to, Blake did this, you only have to look at a tree to realize there's, you know, there's a huge kind of living intelligence embodied in that tree. It's got a tremendous wisdom about how to live in a
Yeah.
tree-like kind of way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is beginning to be talked about now. It's not quite so strange as it was even 10 years ago.
Mm.
Um, but if that's true of you know, kind of creatures, biological creatures, then why wouldn't it be true of other aspects of reality as well? And so I think, you know, beginning to develop that sense of a wider ecology is important, but with this coupled to this sense that this is going to be expansive for us as well, because it's demanding, it makes demands on us, but they're demands that might lead through these periods of breakdown into wider perceptions. So yeah, there's kind of whole worldview, if you like. This isn't just, Blake doesn't treat angels as just kind of strange, anomalous quirks that then lead to slightly nerdy debates about evidence and proof and stuff. He's not remotely interested in that.
Yes.
He's saying
Yes. Yeah.
follow it and see where it leads.
Yeah. Makes sense. It's and I suppose, yeah, many will struggle with that perhaps because of their, you know, maybe even unexamined sort of you know, assumptions or metaphysical assumptions. But yeah, so with the imagination then, would William Blake, you know, like you said, he was at this point where he was perhaps, you know, sort of with, you know, he had Locke, Bacon and Newton sort of, maybe was it prior to him, but then he was coming into the sort of, I don't know, what would it be, the industrial age or something, and the sort of quite mechanistic, rationalistic age. What do you think he would see now? Would he see us as, would he see the imagination as perhaps as residing in the collective shadow almost? Like it's something we're just not attuned with as a culture, as a world almost?
Yeah, I try and resist in the book. Well, I do resist reaching to sort of subsequent psychological categories like the shadow, from Jung, of course, um, because I feel like what's part of what fascinates me about Blake is he lives before psychology. He lives before modern psychology
I
anyway,
see. Okay,
in the
okay.
Georgian period. I mean, the word psychology is actually coined by Aristotle probably or something like that.
Right,
But
right, right.
nonetheless, this very modern sense that psychology is primarily about your inner life and my inner life as kind of worlds unto themselves. Um, and so I think that he would say that the imagination hasn't gone anywhere. But what's happened is that because our relationship to the inside of the whole world, to nature, which is imagination itself, is dynamic. It depends largely on what we take to it that then affects what shows up. We've
Mm.
we've sort of closed in on ourselves. His famous image of Newton, one of this triumvirate, Bacon, Newton, and Locke, which shows Newton on the seabed, sort of sitting on rocks,
I've
looking
seen
down
it.
at an
Yeah,
unraveling scroll with a pair of compasses and searching, looking at an arc and a square. Um, and this is again, Blake's images are not just sort of whimsical. There's deep meaning in this. So what Newton is trying to do in that image is square the circle. And squaring the circle is an ancient way of saying how can the human intellect, its kind of conscious engagement with things, its wisdom, where does it reach the threshold of what seems impossible? And so Newton is deeply um, engaged in the age-old quest to understand things, and it has its own brilliance. I mean, it is an astonishing thing that Newton's second law of motion, F equals ma, this immensely simple equation, can describe all sorts of phenomena. That is a moment of genius, imaginative revelation, to see that kind of symmetry. But it's got this huge price. And so Blake is at once celebrating Newton's attempt to engage with this age-old question of squaring the circle, but showing that it's taken him to the bottom of a sea. So he's become uncoupled from reality. He's not aware of the life around him. Now, he's probably
right.
unfair on Newton because we know now that Newton was into all sorts of esoterica. Angels were only the start of it for Newton. But nonetheless, Newton stands for a kind of mentality in Blake. And I think that's the kind of way that Blake would understand what's going on now.
Mm.
Clearly we live in this hugely imaginative time. And you need to look at the entertainment industry and technology only develops because there's been imagination for that technology first. That's what it
Right.
takes to corral a whole economy,
Yeah.
and countless millions of people now working in technology, working in the entertainment industry, and so on. The imagination hasn't gone anywhere, but it's just got very rather fixated and trapped in certain forms. But the good thing is that energy is still readily available. It probably only just takes a little nudge to kind of push it into new directions again. So
Mm.
I think that's Blake. He can be depressed about the modern world. You mentioned industrialization and this famous phrase of his, the dark satanic mills, captures the mentality as well as the manifestation of the Industrial Revolution that was underway in his time, but really kicked off in the Victorian period.
Mm.
Um, but nonetheless, the positive side is that our world, and with all the ways that it is still an extraordinarily imaginative enterprise. It just needs understanding better, and then that energy can flow more fully.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting. What comes to mind for me is like this sort of imagination and psychotherapy, and Yeah, you sort of, I think in a way it's always been there, but obviously people talk about the sort of the dark days of behaviorism and stuff like this, but nevertheless in the background, you said psychodynamic. I have a particular interest in sort of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic theory therapy, and this sort of, yeah, I mean, because right now there's this sort of, well, over the last sort of 15-20 years, this sort of mentalization based theory, and the very root of it is actually imagination. It's like being able to imagine in to be able to see. One comes to develop one also, sort of the sense of self comes through being imagined by the caregiver and seeing oneself in the eye of another. And then actually, that sort of, so a sort of a mentalization based approach, even psychotherapy is like we spoke about earlier, those individuals who perhaps become locked in their own sort of worlds. It's actually like helping the person perhaps, it's sort of, yeah, reinvigorating that sort of the imagination in a way to sort of fully participate in life again, and to perhaps actually even imagine what oneself is and can be. And I suppose then, so yeah, it sounds like what William Blake is doing is to try and help, or he's thinking about having a fuller perception of life. Is that this? I wanted to just brief, at least for a little bit, talk about your book, Dante's Divine Comedy, just because I've read quite a bit of it, and I thought it was I think it's a great book, and actually, William Blake as well. He painted some of Dante, didn't he? Of his cantos. So is that where there's a resonance between them, that they were both interested in a sort of a fuller perception of, yeah, reality?
Yes, I mean, so Dante, again, Blake knew about Dante, presumably much of his life, all his life, but towards the end of his life, he even learns Italian in order to read the Divine Comedy afresh, and then
Wow.
begins this huge undertaking of illustrating the 100 cantos to the Divine Comedy. It's one of the sort of marathon challenges that various artists take on. And he was working on it still when he died, actually, so he didn't complete it. But there's a lot of the infernal ones there, quite a few of the purgatorial ones, and then the paradisal ones are the ones which are least finished, but sort of suitable that he was working on that when he died. Um, and maybe in a way, what's interesting about Blake's engagement with Dante is where they kind of disagreed as much as where they agreed, because they clearly did agree that this life is not all that there is. Blake states it very clearly when this vegetative body, as he puts it, the sort of biological body, dies, will return to the eternal realm, from which is anyway the source and wellspring of the life of the vegetative. It's not like we're ever uncoupled from it, in fact. And Dante, clearly engages in this very elaborate exploration of the afterlife that's also here, because again, it becomes very clear that hell is not just elsewhere. People can be in hellish states of
Right,
mind
right, right,
right
right,
now,
right.
and similarly with purgatory and paradise. So there's a kind of blurring of things.
I
Um,
see.
but yeah, I mean, Blake says that Dante is in the divine league, the Champions League of divine poets, alongside Shakespeare and Milton and others.
Right, right.
But because I think because what he does do is, um, you know, these writers are the most expansive that we have. They
Yeah.
really are trying to um, help us engage with reality at its fullest extent that certainly, we can grasp as mortals.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And like you said there about, well, firstly, I mean, I was absolutely flabbergasted at the detail in, this sort of guide for spiritual journey, Dante's Divine Comedy, in terms of the details that you sort of are going into and like describing what's going on in the, because I just assume this, like a lot of contemporary poems, sort of, I don't know, I think they're a lot, they can be quite brief, and they're not, whereas this is going into like what the people are wearing, and what's going on in these scenes. It's more like it seemed like a novel. But I was going to ask what you were sort of, I think, touching on there, which is, you know I don't know if in researching and writing the book you were able to, or if there is an understanding as to what extent Dante was talking about like this sort of, I don't know what we might be colloquially said the afterlife, like what's going on after death. But I think because I was wondering actually, and I suppose, having an interest in sort of psychology, psychotherapy and things, and actually just life is actually, as you've just alluded to there, is that these stages or, hell, purgatory, and heaven are actually happening right now, almost like all the time. But actually, it doesn't necessarily mean though that it's almost it can be a sort of a both. It's a sort of it's happening now, and then maybe, if you are someone who believes in, a life beyond this, it's a continuation almost, or that it can happen as well. So I suppose what I'm asking is how do you know how was Dante explicitly talking about life beyond the corporeal sort of time here? And maybe you don't know. And how do you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the quick answer is yes. I don't know, hedge that, but quite what it means to say yes is then the beginnings of a whole investigation, if you like. But Dante and Blake, they're both clear, I think, that that investigation does begin now. Um,
Mm,
and the way that it begins is by the kind of life you're living, what you're capable of perceiving. And, if there were one answer that I gave to what's the meaning of this life, I think it would be to become more and more capable of the experience of life, um, to open up to that. I liked it when you just said now, I'm interested in psychotherapy and that, but well, life, and then that's the point,
mm,
it's about being interested in life itself. Um, so, um, you know, the reason why the Divine Comedy is such an extraordinary book text, and it is, I mean, it's one of these texts that the more you study it, the more it's sort of incomprehensible how it was ever written. Um,
yeah.
you know, it, there's so much that um, in every kind of inflection,
Mm,
that for me it's undoubtedly an inspired text. Dante was
right.
definitely the conduit, and it took Dante, I don't know, 15 or more years to write it. So
Right.
this is a major undertaking, and not just because of, should I put that word here or this word there? Not that kind of editorial time, but having to sit with perceptions until they disclose themselves to you more and more fully, and then you could write about it.
Mm,
So, to my mind, I guess what happened with Dante, we don't know exactly, but I guess what happened is that he had this absolutely massive midlife disaster when he was banned from Florence because of the civil wars going on the Italian peninsula. And he lost everything. He lost his family, he lost his money, but he lost his status and he lost his poetry, really, because there wasn't one Italian language at the time. It's Florentine that he spoke, a dialect that he wrote in. And so going to another city was to lose his language. It's the reason why there is one Italian language now, more or less, is because of Dante, in fact. But um, he loses absolutely everything, and again, it's this sense of breakdown that might lead to breakthroughs, and I think that Dante undoubtedly experienced infernal states of mind in that time, and
mm,
this isn't just
mm,
feeling depressed at the loss, but the rage, the anger, the envy,
mm,
these kind of infernal um, feelings that if they really seize you, they could grip you for what might seem
yeah.
forever. So he definitely, that's partly what he's writing about. But I think he must have also had some sort of glimpse, ecstatic experience um, that didn't, as it were, reveal to him the whole of paradise in one great download. Because part of his genius is though that he could take those intimations and really run with them, really make something of them through the imagination. And so the way that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, I think, is itself a kind of inspiration. Um, you know, Dante is a genius, but he's still a human. And he, moreover, writes quite explicitly. He often breaks the fourth wall. He addresses you as the reader very directly, very often, and says, "Look, I'm not just writing about this for my own well-being, useful though that is. Um, Follow me. You can follow me too." So this is the sort of Dante equivalent of the Blake in "I give you the end of a golden string." Um, he wants to communicate that to us, and moreover to the future. Sometimes the Divine Comedy is read as if it was the last great work of the medieval mind, but Dante saw the medieval mind coming undone, He
Mm,
lives in this very early mercantile period. His father was a very successful cloth merchant, with new money, if you like. The old
mm,
feudalism had broken down, and so a new perception of the world was becoming possible. And so I think he's very much writing for that. And one of the key elements is precisely the one that you're highlighting there, that um, different parts of life coexist. Hell is here as well as whatever happens in the hereafter.
right, right.
Purgatory and paradise too. And I mean, one of the reasons why the Divine Comedy woke up for me was because of my own therapy, actually, that I did quite a traditional psychoanalytic therapy, going many times a week for several years. And it was very good in some ways, but I did get quite stuck in it. And it was only when I began reading the Divine Comedy, and particularly the Purgatory, where there's a lot of
Mm,
suffering, but there's always the possibility of hope, um, that I began to get a felt sense of what that might be like,
mm.
in my own life. And so my suffering gradually began to shift. So it was when a book speaks to you like that, you can forget, but you try and take it seriously.
Yeah. So do you think then in your experience, like, and I think you perhaps was suggesting maybe it is the case, at least for you with and William Blake, and like, is there, and maybe with Dante, is something lost when looking at it or giving it a sort of a sort of a psychoanalytic or Jungian treatment? Because in a way, it's like when I think of like when I the Divine Comedy, in a sense, I don't, it's mythical, or it's a myth in the sense of it's not describing something that has happened, but that's happening all the time, right now, and perennially. It's like this sort of, the hell, purgatory, and paradisio, are places perhaps on earth and perhaps beyond, but definitely places on earth. And that then, in a sense, psychotherapy is almost like a distillation of that process, in a sort of like it's a journeying. But I suppose because I suppose what I'm saying is that and like you could see it, what I'm doing now, and I think other people probably have, is like almost read it in a sort of a Jungian sense. But I'm wondering, do you see utility in that or some benefit in that, or do you think it actually loses some sort of the magic is lost almost in doing that?
I mean, I think Jung actually himself gives us a big clue here, because especially since the publication of this red book, which was his way of trying to convey this big breakdown that he had in the
Yeah.
mid part of the 1910s, um, after his split with Freud. He dwelt for several years in a kind of liminal zone where insanity and sanity kind of mingled, and he had all sorts of
Mm,
strange experiences and so on. And he worked privately on this text that's now been published called the Red Book. Um, and I mean, I was a bit ambivalent when it was published, because I thought we're sort of not supposed to see that, because the
right.
trouble is that it becomes a bit like a sort of Bible. Like, the truth is in this text, whereas the truth's not in the text. The truth is in the life that you're living.
Right.
And what Jung did do then for the rest of his life, and published, and so wanted to be known, was offer various models that tried to convey something of his direct experience, and the way he felt it could speak to the wider human population. Um, and one of the models was the psychological types,
Yeah.
extroversion and introversion and so on. And then another model was more alchemical, the idea that actually, we need to kind of carefully hold ourselves and allow deeper processes, the sort of space and time to unfold. So he,
Right.
he comes up with various models. Now, but the trouble is that people take the model, they take the map for the territory, as the
Yes.
expression is now. And I think that that's one of the another way of doing it, which I think is the more Blakean way. I think it's the way that Tolkien wrote as well, actually, is to offer a complete world, invite you to step into that world, and it's in that immersion that things will change. So it's resisting the kind of model
Yeah.
approach, or the allegorical approach. Another C.S. Lewis probably is more of an allegorical writer, and you can sort of see correspondences. Aslan is some sort of divine presence, and so on, and the Snow Queen is some sort of demonic presence. And I mean that C.S. Lewis read the Divine Comedy, wrote brilliantly about the Divine Comedy. So these people are all talking to each other as well. But
Mm.
nonetheless, I think what Blake offers and what appeals to me about him is this more immersive approach, because there's a lot to be said for the models, but the great challenge which Blake was onto actually about the models is that um, they hold you with their own fascination. No one is actually dealing with the shadow. There's no such thing as the shadow. It's just a model for some aspect of life
Right.
that
Yeah.
has got
Yeah.
a bit uncoupled.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think Blake helps us to remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so maybe finishing up then with William Blake and on that sort of immersion and like, not being bewitched by models and the sort of perhaps like Iain McGilchrist might say sort of living in a left hemispheric way and rather actually sort of being in the world almost in a right hemispheric way. Again, even in describing that, it's kind of like a model, but you get what I'm getting at. Did William Blake, like, maybe he didn't make suggestions, but can we, from reading William Blake and understanding his life, are there any sort of, how does one, is it through art, poetry, like, just is it about just at least being disposing oneself and just sort of saying, well, I'm gonna just try and be open. Is that really the beginning almost?
That is the heart of it, definitely. That you get a sense and taste for the infinite, as a contemporary, a romantic figure whose contemporary Blake put it. And So you organize a life, or you allow to emerge a whole way of life that opens up for that. And traditionally, that might have meant becoming a monk or a nun. You can still do that these days, but it's not nearly such a large part of wider society as it once was. And so I think that's part of the challenge of now is what mode of life can help us grow into this wider awareness more and more. And people have got onto certain aspects of it. Meditation is clearly part of that. Meditation's a huge part of my life, um, and retreats and so on, pilgrimages. I think maybe one key thing at the moment is getting outside. Partly because
Yeah.
of the psychologizing turn, we've tended to turn inwards and
Yeah.
treat our minds as like as many plates sort of spinning. As if you can get them, get one more
Yeah.
spinning, then maybe your life will get a bit better, sort of thing. No, maybe we are reaching a phase where going outside is much more important, and that of course appeals because of ecological concerns and the sense of disruption there. Um, but I think that again, I think the presence of AI um, can be a good challenge here, because I think that the technology, if technology is first dreamt, if we've imagined it first and imagined a world that then is welcoming to technology, that means that technology is a kind of symptom of what's going on inside of us, and I think that AI is a kind of symptom of what's going on inside of us, and I think it's precisely this invitation to awaken to a renewed, I should say, sense of intelligence. Artificial intelligence clearly has its own brilliance, and it is quite dazzling,
Mm.
and bewitching, misenchanting.
Mm.
But once you've kind of got over that, and you get over that quite quickly, there's a new release of ChatGPT or something comes out and you think that's amazing, but within a week or so you can sort of see what it's doing. It's fallen a bit flat. We're always one step ahead of these things actually, but that one step aheadness is what I think the meaning of AI is. What is the nature of our intelligence? It's asking us to ask that all over again.
Right, right,
Um,
right,
and and
right.
I think things like imagination are a huge part of that.
Yeah, and actually, on that, is that then in a sense really, does that capture the imagination, at least insofar as AI in its current public for format is. The difference perhaps with us is that the difference would be that, you know, for as humans, we can be open and porous to, you know, encountering new things, whereas AI, as it is in its, you know, current form, it's not, it's more sort of like working with what it's already got in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually Blake can help us understand AI. He makes quite a distinction between what he calls memory and inspiration. And memory, I mean, memory can be a living thing. Actually, Iain McGilchrist corrected me on this, because there is a kind of memory which is a bringing back into present vitality. So rituals, you know, are kind of inactive memories that return you to some Aboriginal source. But nonetheless, there's a kind of dead memory, which is essentially a data center, that may be a vast memory store in digital form of things as they have been, but by definition, they come from the past. So they hold you back as well. And I think this is one of the reasons why AI will, you know, it's obviously already got its place and it will continue to have a greater place, but it will never satisfy. And because we um, live more when we're flourishing, at least from the future. So inspiration matters to
Right.
us, not just memory. If someone's living, again, you know, you'll know this, if someone is trapped in the past, they're not likely to be functioning very well.
Mm.
We might say they're unwell. Whereas someone that has an openness to the future, to novelty, to what life might bring, and so on, the risks involved in that, as well as the revelations and hopes, that is what it is to live. And so, you know, this sort of AIs just can't do that.
Mm.
Um, you know, their whole structure is based on memory, and we have memories, but this porousness is open to another possibility. So that's one way of keeping a kind of clarity about what artificial intelligence is and what it isn't.
Yeah, that's makes a lot of sense. Um, oh wow, that's I'm just mindful of the time, and I think yeah, that's, you know, I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, well, look, thank you. I mean, I love talking about these things as well, and I think I wonder increasingly whether this podcast form, you know, it's popular, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, is because in the dialogue you feel this, you know, when a conversation's good, you feel this kind of third presence. You
Mm,
feel something, you know, pressing in, and you know, where you feel yourself reaching for words to say something that is going to take the conversation somewhere, and that reaching is itself, because I think language is given to us as well. Fundamentally, it's not, you know, my possession in your possession that somehow we're privately using, but it's given to us, and so I hope that even the podcast form is sort of part of this awakening.
that's actually, yeah, I thought that's really interesting. Yeah, that makes sense actually. Okay, great. Well, so yeah, so those who have got to this point, you know, they can read more about William Blake in your book. In America, it's not out yet. It's
Yeah, so
out
it's
in,
out in September 2025 in the US, so shortly,
okay,
but
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and then for those in the UK, yeah, it's out, and I'll put a link in the description for people to, yeah, go and find it. Um, yeah, so
Well,
yeah,
look, thank you. I mean, you know, I'm serious about it takes a bit of effort to set up these conversations and things, so but I think they're important. So thank you for all that you're doing as well.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure, like yourself as well. I mean, I just I love having these conversations. Like you, and I think you've perhaps captured maybe why, or one element of is you. I do feel at times like, yeah, it's like this sort of, it's like an adventure. It's kind of like it's like encountering new things, and maybe that's partly as well like why we both perhaps do related things, you know, in terms of work as well as in that, in being interested in people, because ultimately people are the port, you know, that is where life happens, you know, and it's what more will we find? But yeah, thank you, Mark, as well, because I've and also, yeah, the I know I haven't read, I will read it in full in time, awake, but you know, and again, for those listening, Mark, you've written several books as well. I mean, I know Awake is your current one, but if people are interested in your work, they can find other works.
Yeah, look, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I have a website, of course, markvernon.com, and I try and make sure that everything is there somewhere or other. So
Yeah.
that's one place to go. But I have a Substack, and I use social media, and
Yes.
mm.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you again, and yeah, I guess good luck with all of the rest of the book stuff and the what's the word? Is it the release in America? And it's quite exciting.
It is. I mean, I enjoy it basically. Selling books is hard work though as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
nonetheless, yeah, it's in the hopefully it's in the service of something greater, which is what we're talking about really. So that's yeah. Thank you, thank you.
yeah. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day.